The Long Road by Wolfland. Chapter 14. Galvanize. Pokemon Trainer's Handbook, page 21. When Pokemon grow with enough experience, they can become even stronger through the phenomenon of evolution. There are many different mechanisms of Pokemon evolution. They can evolve in the heat of battle, through the use of evolutionary stone or item, see page 33, or even by being traded between trainers. Skarmory seemed thankful that it finally wasn't landing outside of some sort of cave or cavern, as it dutifully waited outside the Stone family home. The flight from Sootopolis had taken nearly the entire day, and even though the steel bird's head was held high, Steven could see its wings drooping from exhaustion. Finally, he managed to pluck the house key from his pack, and as quietly as he could, he opened the front door. He hadn't bothered to call ahead, and at this time of night, his father was probably sitting in the living room reading by the fire, or working late at the office. The chair near the hearth was empty, and the fireplace dark. Steven sighed as Skarmory followed him into the foyer. I should have guessed. Skarmory's head cocked to the side at its trainer's dejected tone. Not that Steven was really surprised, but it still felt like a punch to the gut to see his father hadn't changed after all this time. There was something else, too, that hadn't changed, and as he turned to head towards the kitchen, a familiar face poked around the corner. Oh my! Steven! The motherly old housekeeper bustled out of the kitchen. I had no idea you would be home tonight! You should have called ahead, and I would have prepared something special for you! As she reached out to envelop him in a hug, Skarmory squawked and fanned out its wings, startled by her quick approach. The gesture wasn't meant to be aggressive, but it was still an imposing sight, which caused the housekeeper to scream and jump back with a hand over her heart. My heavens! Her eyes were wide as she looked over the agitated flyer, who at this point had backpedaled a few steps, its talons scrabbling over the tiled floor. Steven quickly pulled himself between his Pokemon and the frightened woman, and he reached forward to give her a hug of apology. Miss Evans, I'm so sorry about Skarmory. He's my newest Pokemon, so he might not be ready to meet many people at the moment. By now, Skarmory had tucked its wings back and was giving the housekeeper a guarded look. Recovering from her initial shock, Mrs. Evans peeked over Steven's shoulder, and her voice took on a matronly tone. Well, we'll just have to take it slow then, that's all. Steven blinked at her quick change in attitude, and she easily slipped from his grasp and stepped around to meet Skarmory once more. Why, hello there, dear. Steven has told me you're a bit of a shy one. Eyes widening at her assumption, Steven reached out to place a cautionary hand on her shoulder. I'm not sure that's the issue, Mrs. Evans. Nonsense! Anyone would be shy without a proper introduction. Here, allow me. She briskly stepped away from Steven's hold, and he sputtered another warning, but she simply marched up to the flying type and gave a polite curtsy. Skarmory's head cocked to the side once again, eyes wary, but it remained still. Skarmory, was it? My name is Mrs. Evans, and I've watched over your trainer ever since he was a little boy crawling around in diapers. Skarmory's gaze flicked behind Mrs. Evans and caught Steven's increasingly embarrassed expression with a gleam of amusement in its eye. It has always been my duty to take care of him and his family, and if you are his Pokemon, then that makes you part of this family too. She punctuated her statement with a decisive nod. Instantly, Skarmory's demeanor changed. Its gaze flicked from Mrs. Evans and then to Steven, who noticed and tensed up, fearing the housekeeper's forwardness might trigger something unpleasant. But his worry was for naught, as Skarmory looked back to the housekeeper and clacked its beak, eyes softening as it gave a small warble. Mrs. Evans broke into a motherly smile, and she beckoned the bird to follow her. "Now, why don't you say we start things off on the right foot and have a snack?" To Stephen's amazement, Skarmory rattled its wings with a happy caw and bobbed its head in agreement. Slack-jawed, he watched as his Pokémon trotted off down the hall behind Mrs. Evans, totally obedient. It had taken him months to earn Skarmory's trust, to the point where it wouldn't lash out with its wings every time he tried to go near it. And yet, Mrs. Evans had tamed it in only a matter of minutes. He would have remained staring down the hallway if his rumbling stomach didn't snap him from his stupor. Shaking his head, he too followed the housekeeper into the kitchen. Once both Stephen and Skarmory were contentedly munching on their dinner, Mrs. Evans drew a chair up to the table and plopped down with a tired smile. "Now then, tell me, what brings you back to Rustboro after all this time?" Stephen finished chewing before he answered. "Well, we were on our way to get our last badge at the Rustboro gym, so I figured maybe I would stop by and surprise Dad. But that clearly didn't work out so well." "Well, you certainly surprised me," she offered with a laugh. Skarmory perked up from its meal and warbled a small apology. Stephen gave his Pokémon a curious look, but its sharp demeanor returned, and it issued a screech as a rebuttal. Looks like Mrs. Evans was the only one on Skarmory's good side. "Although," she continued, oblivious to the exchange, "your father probably won't be back any time soon. He's away in Kanto for an important meeting for at least the rest of the week, if not longer. How long were you planning on staying in town?" Stephen frowned. "Not that long. If that's the case, perhaps we'll just stay the night and be on our way in the morning." "Well, you know you're always welcome to stay over as long as you want. It's still your home, after all. But if you're in a hurry, I don't want to hold you up." Shoveling another forkful into his mouth, Stephen nodded in appreciation. As nice as it was to see Mrs. Evans again, he had no desire to linger here, not with the house being just as empty as he remembered it. Except this time he wasn't really alone. Before he turned in for the night, he brought out the rest of his Pokémon for Mrs. Evans to meet. Predictably, she fawned over how much Matang had grown, but Stephen was happy to see that she was just as enamored with the rest of his team as well. Armaldo and Cladle gave her a bit of a fright, but Cradilly made up for it with her cheerful crooning. Aggron got in on the action too, and was content to curl up, as best he could, at the housekeeper's side for the remainder of the evening. Lounging on the living room sofa, with the light of a crackling fire dancing in Aggron's steel plates, Stephen eyed the rest of his team. They were all happily gathered together, making the room much cozier than it normally was. Even Skarmory had joined without protest, quietly roosting on the floor near the hearth after Mrs. Evans had scolded it for scratching the backrest of a chair with its talons. Aggron's soft snoring continued long after the housekeeper went to bed, while Cradilly and Armaldo had nestled together a wary distance away from the fire and fallen asleep as well. The only movement in the room, besides Cladle's rhythmic bobbing, was the slide of 2 red eyes to catch Stephen's own. Matang's satisfied hum washed over him, and Stephen sank deeper into the plush cushions. It was only after he saw that Matang hadn't relinquished its stare that a realization struck. Ever since Lily Cove, they had been plunging forward full steam with their league challenge, leaving no room for the very thing they were doing at this moment, relaxing. And not just resting between training sessions, but spending time as companions and friends. Sitting upright, Stephen finally caught the meaning behind Matang's gaze. It wasn't accusing, and it wasn't smug. It was simply happy to share time together with the first person it had ever bonded with. and Steven's expression melted into a warm smile, laced with the tiniest hint of guilt. But then he paused, brow furrowing in thought. What would become of them after the final badge? There was, of course, the chance to challenge the league for the title of champion, but the odds of succeeding were so slim. If he failed, what next? While it wasn't uncommon for trainers to go on the league's badge-seeking quest, not many actually succeeded in getting all 8, as he hoped to. That meant that, by now, the pool of worthy opponents would have shrunk considerably. With no more trainers to battle and no more badges to obtain, their journey would, in essence, be over. Except that Steven wasn't ready to relinquish what he considered the best years of his life, spent traveling side by side with his closest friends. No, his family. He didn't want it to end. "I've been going about this all wrong," he murmured to himself, although a questioning chirp from Matang told him his starter had heard him. He shook his head dismissively, but Matang was not going to let it drop so easily. At the sound of his partner's soft chattering, Steven grabbed a pillow from the sofa and padded over to join his starter near the fire. Settling down against the crook of Matang's leg, he gave his friend a wistful smile. "I've been thinking, but you knew that already." Matang rolled its eyes. "Truthfully, I should probably sleep on it. Do you mind if I wait to tell you until the morning?" A quiet hum told him Matang was okay with waiting, and it shifted slightly, nestling the two of them in a comfortable pile. Steven chuckled. "It's been a while, huh? Dad would never let us sleep by the fire. But he's not here, and I won't tell if you won't." He felt the reverberation of Matang's agreement as his eyes slid closed. His mind was made up. Relaxing, he allowed the waning heat of the fire and the growing warmth of his Pokémon to lull him into a blissful slumber.